its member states, together with our allies, will hold Russia accountable. The European Council will convene today and will agree in principle on a package of massive and targeted sanctions. We will also decide on political, financial and humanitarian aid for Ukraine and its people. Ukrainian cities have been hit, innocent people killed, women, men, children are fleeing for their lives. They need our staunch support more than ever. We will also discuss the geopolitical, economic and human implications of this aggression against Ukraine, and I do not believe that Russian people want war. You do not want to lose young men to a senseless war with a brother nation, serving as cannon fodder for an unjustified, unlawful and foolish war. I also appeal to Belarus and its people. You have the choice not to follow Russia's destructive action. You have the choice not to take part in this needless tragedy against your neighbors in Ukraine. And we, the EU, stand rock solid, united, firm and determined, together with NATO, together with our allies, partners and friends, to hold Russia accountable, to support Ukraine and to protect peace in Europe. We stand shoulder to shoulder with all countries across the world that want to uphold the rules-based international order for the sake of peace. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung.
Thanks a lot. Thomas Kutschka, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I've got two questions. The first one to the Commission President. Which are the next practical steps the EU can take to help Ukraine cope with internally displaced people? And what are the next steps that could be taken to also help the neighboring countries that are probably seeing an influx of refugees in the next days and weeks? And a question to President Michel. When you called the special meeting yesterday, that was certainly before the attack. Did you have any indications yesterday afternoon when you took the decision to assemble leaders? Thank you.
Indeed, we have worked for weeks to be prepared for the worst to come, hoping for the best, but being prepared for the worst. And this was concerning strengthening our resilience in the cyber field, making sure that we are independent, can be independent of any kind of pressure from Russian gas supplies. We have reached that stage. And indeed, to prepare for potential refugees. We have, with all the frontline member states, now explicit contingency plans to welcome and host immediately those refugees from Ukraine. And what internally displaced people are concerned, we have a lot of support through ECHO, humanitarian aid, shelter, and all the necessities people who are internally displaced immediately need. On top, there will be financial support increased for Ukraine on top of the 1.2 billion macro-financial assistance, which is available right now. So the preparedness is fully alerted. And we hope that there will be as little as possible refugees, but we are fully prepared for them and they are welcome.
We had indeed indications that the situation was dramatically deteriorating on the ground, but we didn't know that such an aggression, a military invasion, a full-scale military invasion would take place during the last night.
Okay. NPR.
And Deutsche Welle, thank you very much. To all three of you, Ukraine is now under attack because it wanted to come closer to your institutions. This is why it was attacked. First Maidan, and then over its wish to join NATO. And yet all of your appeals for dialogue have fallen on deaf ears. We saw the buildup happen. Nothing you did worked. What more could you have done, and how do you feel today when you are sitting here saying that innocent lives are going to be lost? And these are people whose only crime, even in the words of the Kremlin, are that they wanted to be closer to Europe. Thanks.
Well, I think it's very important to remember that there is one that is the aggressor, one one state that is responsible for what is happening now in Ukraine, and that is Russia. Russia is the country which is responsible for the loss of lives and the aggressive actions against Ukraine. And we have reached out to Russia for many, many years, actually, and especially during the last months, to engage in political dialogue to try to prevent this conflict. But at the same time, we are, as Ursula von der Leyen said, we have also been absolutely prepared for the worst, and that's what's happening now. So we have to remember that there's one aggressor, and that's Russia, and Russia is responsible for what we see evolving in Ukraine now.
There's a process to join the European Union, and since many years we are working with Ukraine, and we have gone far. Ukraine has reached quite a substantial progress if you compare it to years ago, to really have the closeness to the European Union at our eyes. We have a free trade agreement with Ukraine. This is a privileged access to the European single market, an increasing integration of the Ukrainian market into the European single market. We are strongly supporting financially in the case of reforms that are necessary without any doubt in Ukraine, but also strategic investments in Ukraine in a broad set of fields. We are very intensively working on the energy security of Ukraine. Over the last years, we have basically been able to guarantee the energy security of Ukraine through reverse flow, for example, of gas, but also investing massively in building up a renewable sector. Right now, Ukraine is decoupling its electricity grid from the Russian electricity grid, and we stand ready to support them in case that there are any kind of difficulties. This is not easy, this is not trivial, this is much earlier than we had planned, but this shows that there's an enormous amount of support for our friends in Ukraine.
And we'll go to Interfax Ukraine. Thank you, Anna. Interfax Ukraine, Irina Sommer. Secretary General, don't you think that if in Bucharest Ukraine got invitation to join NATO, nothing will happen like what we have today? And the question for your leadership, when we are talking about political support, can we talk about perspective of membership, at least political decision? Thank you.
But again, we have to remember who is responsible. What we made clear in Bucharest in 2008, and what NATO allies have made clear again and again, is that every nation has the right to choose its own path, and that we support Ukraine in their aspirations to further integrate with the Euro-Atlantic community, and also their aspirations for membership. And then it is for Ukraine to decide whether they want to belong to NATO, and then it's for 30 allies to decide on the question of membership and when Ukraine is ready to join. That is our right to decide. Russia has not right to attack, use violence, use their armed forces to invade an independent sovereign nation, regardless of what they think about NATO membership, because that's not an excuse whatsoever to use military force against a neighbor. That's just not the world we like to live in, where big powers as Russia uses military force to try to coerce other countries, and if they don't act as they want, actually invade them. And that's what we are seeing now.
We recognize the EU aspiration of Ukraine, and you know this is a decision that needs to be taken by the member states, but it is very clear that the last years we have worked a lot. It was described by the President of the Commission in order to strengthen all the ties with Ukraine. We have encouraged Ukraine to implement reforms. They made a lot of progress, more economic relationships, more economic ties in different fields. And it will be the occasion tonight at the level of the European Council to have a debate about the way we will support Ukraine in different fields, the political field included.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference.
its member states, together with our allies, will hold Russia accountable. The European Council will convene today and will agree in principle on a package of massive and targeted sanctions. We'll also decide on political, financial and humanitarian aid for Ukraine and its people. Ukrainian cities have been hit, innocent people killed, women, men, children are fleeing for their lives. They need our staunch support more than ever. We will also discuss the geopolitical, economic and human implications of this aggression against Ukraine, and I do not believe that Russian people want war. You do not want to lose young men to a senseless war with a brother nation, serving as cannon fodder for an unjustified, unlawful and foolish war. I also appeal to Belarus and its people. You have the choice not to follow Russia's destructive action. You have the choice not to take part in this needless tragedy against your neighbors in Ukraine. And we, the EU, stand rock solid, united, firm and determined, together with NATO, together with our allies, partners and friends, to hold Russia accountable, to support Ukraine and to protect peace in Europe. We stand shoulder to shoulder with all countries across the world that want to uphold the rules-based international order for the sake of peace. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung.
Thanks a lot. Thomas Kutschka, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I've got two questions. The first one to the Commission President. Which are the next practical steps the EU can take to help Ukraine cope with internally displaced people? And what are the next steps that could be taken to also help the neighboring countries that are probably seeing an influx of refugees in the next days and weeks? And a question to President Michel. When you called the special meeting yesterday, that was certainly before the attack. Did you have any indications yesterday afternoon when you took the decision to assemble leaders? Thank you.
Indeed, we have worked for weeks to be prepared for the worst to come, hoping for the best, but being prepared for the worst. And this was concerning strengthening our resilience in the cyber field, making sure that we are independent, can be independent of any kind of pressure from Russian gas supplies. We have reached that stage. And indeed, to prepare for potential refugees. We have, with all the frontline member states, now explicit contingency plans to welcome and host immediately those refugees from Ukraine. And what internally displaced people are concerned, we have a lot of support through ECHO, humanitarian aid, shelter, and all the necessities people who are internally displaced immediately need. On top, there will be financial support increased for Ukraine on top of the 1.2 billion macro-financial assistance, which is available right now. So the preparedness is fully alerted, and we hope that there will be as little as possible refugees, but we are fully prepared for them and they are welcome.
We had indeed indications that the situation was dramatically deteriorating on the ground, but we didn't know that such an aggression, a military invasion, a full-scale military invasion would take place during the last night.
Okay, NPR.
And Deutsche Welle, thank you very much. To all three of you, Ukraine is now under attack because it wanted to come closer to your institutions. This is why it was attacked. First, Maidan, and then over its wish to join NATO. And yet all of your appeals for dialogue have fallen on deaf ears. We saw the buildup happen. Nothing you did worked. What more could you have done? And how do you feel today when you are sitting here saying that innocent lives are going to be lost? And these are people whose only crime, even in the words of the Kremlin, are that they wanted to be closer to Europe. Thanks.
Well, I think it's very important to remember that there is one that is the aggressor, one one state that is responsible for what is happening now in Ukraine, and that is Russia. Russia is the country which is responsible for the loss of lives and the aggressive actions against Ukraine. And we have reached out to Russia for many, many years, actually, and especially during the last months, to engage in political dialogue to try to prevent this conflict. But at the same time, as Ursula von der Leyen said, we have also been absolutely prepared for the worst, and that's what's happening now. So we have to remember that there's one aggressor, and that's Russia, and Russia is responsible for what we see evolving in Ukraine now.
There's a process to join the European Union, and since many years we are working with Ukraine, and we have gone far. Ukraine has reached quite a substantial progress if you compare it to years ago, to really have the closeness to the European Union at our eyes. We have a free trade agreement with Ukraine. This is a privileged access to the European single market, and increasing integration of the Ukrainian market into the European single market. We are strongly supporting financially in the case of reforms that are necessary without any doubt in Ukraine, but also strategic investments in Ukraine in a broad set of fields. We are very intensively working on the energy security of Ukraine. Over the last years, we have basically been able to guarantee the energy security of Ukraine through reverse flow, for example, of gas, but also investing massively in building up a renewable sector. Right now, Ukraine is decoupling its electricity grid from the Russian electricity grid, and we stand ready to support them in case that there are any kind of difficulties. This is not easy, this is not trivial, this is much earlier than we had planned, but this shows that there's an enormous amount of support for our friends in Ukraine.
And we'll go to Interfax Ukraine.
Thank you, Anna. Interfax Ukraine, Irina Sommer. Secretary General, don't you think that if in Bucharest Ukraine got invitation to join NATO, nothing will happen like what we have today? And the question for your leadership, when we are talking about political support, can we talk about perspective of membership, at least political decision? Thank you.
But again, we have to remember who is responsible. What we made clear in Bucharest in 2008, and what NATO allies have made clear again and again, is that every nation has the right to choose its own path, and that we support Ukraine in their aspirations to further integrate with the Euro-Atlantic community, and also their aspirations for membership. And then it is for Ukraine to decide whether they would like to belong to NATO, and then it's for 30 allies to decide on the question of membership and when Ukraine is ready to join. That is our right to decide. Russia has not right to attack, use violence, use their armed forces to invade an independent sovereign nation, regardless of what they think about NATO membership, because that's not an excuse whatsoever to use military force against a neighbor. That's just not the world we like to live in, where big powers as Russia uses military force to try to coerce other countries, and if they don't act as they want, actually invade them. And that's what we are seeing now.
We recognize the EU aspiration of Ukraine, and you know this is a decision that needs to be taken by the member states, but it is very clear that the last years we have worked a lot. It was described by the President of the Commission in order to strengthen all the ties with Ukraine. We have encouraged Ukraine to implement reforms. They made a lot of progress, more economic relationships, more economic ties in different fields. And it will be the occasion tonight at the level of the European Council to have a debate about the way we will support Ukraine in different fields, the political field included.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference.
процедуры Совета, я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании представителей Германии и Украины. Решение принимается. На основании правила я также приветствую на сегодняшнем заседании генерального секретаря Организации Объединенных Наций Антонио Гутерреша. В заседании также примет участие на основании 39-й временных правил процедуры Совета заместитель генерального секретаря по политическим вопросам и вопросам миростроительства госпожа Розмари де Карло. Сейчас Совет Безопасности приступит к рассмотрению пункта 2 повестки дня. Я хотел бы приветствовать его превосходительство генерального секретаря Антонио Гутерреша и предоставить ему слово.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, I want to reaffirm what I expressed this morning in the meeting of the General Assembly. But of course, it wouldn't make any sense to bother you reading again the same texts that I'm sure you are all aware of. In between, during the day, a number of events took place, and with your permission, Mr. President, I would like to ask Ms. Rosemary Di Carlo to be able to brief you on those events. But simultaneously, the day was full of rumors and indications that an offensive against the Ukraine was imminent. In the recent past, there were several situations with similar indications, similar rumors. And I never believed in them, convinced that nothing serious would happen. I was wrong. And I would like not to be wrong. So, if indeed an operation is being prepared, I have only one thing to say from the bottom of my heart. President Putin, stop your troops from attacking the Ukraine. Give peace a chance. Too many people have died. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю генерального секретаря за его вступительные замечания. И сейчас я предоставляю слово госпоже Розмари де Карло.
Thank you, Mr. President. Earlier today, the so-called authorities of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics requested military assistance from the Russian Federation. Also today, the Ukrainian authorities declared a nationwide state of emergency and announced other related defense and security measures, including the mobilization of reservists. Throughout the day, we've seen disturbing reports of continued heavy shelling across the contact line and civilian and military casualties. There are also reports of the repeated targeting of civilian infrastructure. This evening, are carrying reports of an ongoing large-scale military buildup and military columns moving towards Ukraine. The Russian has also reportedly shut airspace to civilian craft near the border with Ukraine. The United Nations cannot verify any of these reports, but if these developments were confirmed, they would greatly aggravate an already dangerous situation. The Ukrainian authorities are also reporting a new large-scale cyber attack targeting several state and financial institutions. Mr. President, President Zelensky earlier this evening called for continued diplomacy. Separately, President Putin also spoke about his continued readiness to engage in dialogue. We encourage such efforts, even at this late hour. UN staff remain on the ground to provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine. We are committed to staying and delivering. All parties must ensure their safety and security. Respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law is also paramount. We cannot predict exactly what will happen in the coming hours and days in Ukraine. What is clear is the acceptably high cost in human suffering and destruction of an escalation. The people of Ukraine want peace, and I'm certain the people of Russia want peace. We must do everything in our power to ensure that peace prevails. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю госпожу Ди Карло за ее брифинг и сейчас предоставляю тем членам Совета, которые хотели бы выступить с заявлениями. И первым я предоставляю слово представителю Албании.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, this is the fourth time Council is meeting in Ukraine in a matter of weeks. Every time we meet, reality on the ground confirms bit by bit what some of us have been anticipating. Russia has been saying one thing and doing its contrary. We were told troops were retreating when they only have increased. We were told to stop hysteria since troops were in Russian territory. No longer. They are invading a neighbor, unprovoked with false pretexts, false narratives, and fabricated news. Every development unfolding in the last 48 hours confirms to us and to the world that Russian worries have nothing to do with its security, that its anxieties are not linked to NATO enlargement, that this issue is not a confrontation between Russia and the West. This is a confrontation between Russia and international law, the UN Charter that it deliberately has chosen to ignore, a confrontation between a hegemonistic vision and the rules-based world order. Dear colleagues, it's not about Russia's concern, it's about Russia's appetite. The Ukrainians are facing another aggression just because they dare to exist, because they have chosen to be independent, because they have opted for democracy. Dear colleagues, this is a dark hour not only for Ukraine, but for the entire community as we witness with trepidation the progression of a pure act of aggression carefully planned and cold-bloodedly being executed. We called and hoped for a back down of the Russian Federation from this senseless, destructive and self-destructive action. We repeat the same call for Russia to stop, to reflect, to reverse its illegal decisions, to withdraw from this senseless madness, to de-escalate, not to push towards precipice. Several mechanisms are in place and various proposals have been made, including by President Zelensky, whose calls remain unanswered. Diplomacy is like hope. It dies last. But for it to work, it must be seized, not ignored, as the signal just called for here. Call on the fellow members of the Security Council to rally in support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia has been warned repeatedly that they will be alone, that they will be responsible for the innocent lives lost, including Russians maybe, and for the destruction caused in the heart of Europe in the 21st century. If they choose to continue to execute their plans, as everything indicates, they will bear not only the consequences of the war, but also the historical blame and shame of invading a neighboring country when its responsibility as a permanent member of the Security Council calls for it to work and help preserve peace and security, not to torpedo it. We reiterate our support to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international organizers and territorial waters. In concluding, I welcome the presence of the permanent representative of Ukraine to this meeting. I'd like to convey to him, to the Ukrainian government, that at this most critical moment in their history, they are not alone, and we stand firm in full solidarity with them for their right to be free and choose who they want to be. I thank you.
Я благодарю Благодарю представителя Албании за его заявление. Предоставляю слово представителю Соединенных Штатов.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Secretary General. Thank you for your strong stance and your powerful remarks today at the General Assembly and for your remarks tonight. Colleagues, a few moments ago, I spoke to President Biden, who asked me in the strongest possible terms his and our steadfast support for Ukraine and support for the urgent meeting this Council has convened tonight. Furthermore, he asked me to share that the United States and our allies and partners will continue to respond to Russia's actions with unity, with clarity, and with conviction. We are here tonight because we believe, along with Ukraine, that a full-scale further invasion into Ukraine by Russia is imminent. Tonight, we're seeing the Russians close airspace, move troops into Donbass, and move forces into combat-ready positions. This is a perilous moment, and we're here for one reason and one reason only: to ask Russia to stop, return to your border, send your troops and your tanks and your planes back to their barracks and hangars, and send your diplomats to the negotiating table. Look away from the brink before it is too late. Last week, the United States informed this Council and the world about what we expected to see. We said that Russia would manufacture a pretext for an attack. We have since seen numerous false flag events staged along the lines of contact in Donbass. We said Russia would theatrically convene emergency meetings at the highest levels of the Russian government. We all saw this on Monday with the state televised Security Council meeting held by President Putin, an orchestrated moment in which the Russian government decided to recognize as, and I quote, independent states, unquote, sovereign territory of Ukraine controlled by Russian proxies since 2014. They literally violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity on live television before the world. We said that false proclamations would come declaring Russia would need to defend Russian speakers in Ukraine. We got that and much more from President Putin's speech on Monday and during the speech of the Russian ambassador in the General Assembly today. No one could have predicted how dangerous, inciting, and far-reaching President Putin's speech would be, with Putin arguing for taking the world back in time to an era of empire. Finally, we said the attack would come next, that we could expect communications to be jammed, cyber attacks, shut down key Ukrainian institutions. Last week, we attributed to Russia denial of service attacks against Ukrainian banks, and we saw similar activity this morning targeting government sites as well. And in the last few hours, we have received very concerning reports of destructive malware based on hundreds of computers and executed on at least some. After that, we said would come the bombs and missiles, the soldiers and the tanks. Soldiers have been deployed to the occupied region of Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here tonight because we believe the rest is imminent. Now, over the past few weeks, Russia has called actions hysterical. Russia said we were lying. Russia said we were supplying the world with misinformation. Russia's diplomats even laughed in the face of the human suffering we were sounding the alarm about. But what we said would have come to pass for all the world to see. So let us be clear. All parties are not culpable here. There's no middle ground. Calling for both sides to de-escalate only gives Russia a pass. Russia is the aggressor here. Russia's attack on Ukraine is tantamount to an attack on the UN and every member state in the chamber tonight. The Security Council is charged with adjudicating threats to peace and security. Russia is bypassing it entirely and taking matters into its own hands. And that undermines the institution. It undermines everyone who participates in it. The United States, Ukraine, its allies and partners across Europe, UN officials, every other member of the Security all repeatedly implored Russia to engage at the diplomatic table. Those calls were not heard. Instead, tonight, Russia has brought its people, the Ukrainian people, and the world to the brink of a conflict that will produce an amount of human suffering. I said it in the general this morning, and I'll say it again tonight. Every Russian should be asking themselves right now, Russian lives Putin will sacrifice for his cynical ambitions. Responsible members of this Security Council stand together. We will stand with Ukraine, and we will do so despite a reckless, irresponsible permanent member of the Security Council abusing its to attack its neighbor and subvert the UN and our international system. This morning in the General Assembly, we saw dozens of leaders from across the globe stand up to defend the UN Charter and Ukraine against Russia's brazen attacks. We were proud to stand with them. Today, I had the opportunity to meet with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba, and we're in the General Assembly Hall this morning. Foreign Minister Kuleba received enthusiastic and overwhelming applause after his remarks. Since he could not be here, I would like to conclude by echoing his words. This morning, he warned us all that, quote, no one will be able to sit out this crisis if President Putin decides he can move forward with this aggression against Ukraine. Your governments and your people will face painful consequences together with our government and our people. Unquote. He is right. History tells us that. And we must confront this head on in this council, in the UN, and in our capitals. The people of Ukraine are counting on us. Let's not let them down. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя Соединенных Штатов за ее заявление. Сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Соединенного Королевства.
Mr. President, I thank the Secretary General and Under Secretary General for their remarks. We are here tonight to call on Russia to avert war. For months, Russia has been holding a gun to Ukraine's head. Now, President Putin's finger is on the trigger. A full-scale conflict in a country of 44 million people will bring immense suffering, casualties on both sides, and devastating humanitarian consequences. The members of this Council, the General Assembly, and the Secretary General have all called this week for respect for the principles of the UN Charter. The world is calling for peace, but Russia is not listening. Mr. President, make no mistake, the UK will not compromise. We will not compromise our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, our support for peace, prosperity, and the democratic freedom of the people of Ukraine. We will not compromise our commitment to the purpose and principles of the UN Charter. Above all, the founding principle of this United Nations, that we live together in peace with one another as good neighbours. Russia's actions are an assault on the Charter. And we will not compromise our commitment to a search for peace. We're here for the second time this week in the Council. My Prime Minister and Foreign and Defence Secretaries have been unsparing in their diplomatic efforts. But we have also announced a significant further sanction step against Russia and our allies, a package targeted against some of the Russian oligarchs, banks and politicians supporting President Putin. And we will ratchet up economic consequences should Russia continue its aggression. There is still time for restraint, reason and de-escalation, but that time is now. Thank you.
Я благодарю представительство за ее заявление. Сейчас Франции.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie le secrétaire général pour sa mobilisation et pour son appel que la France soutient pleinement. À l'heure où nous parlons, la Russie est sur le point de provoquer le chaos en Ukraine et de porter un coup injustifiable à la paix et à la sécurité au cœur de l'Europe. Depuis plusieurs mois, le président de la Fédération de Russie a patiemment préparé de quoi mener une offensive majeure contre l'Ukraine. Il a amassé des soldats et des armes à un niveau sans précédent depuis la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Il a incité à la violence par le mensonge et la désinformation. Il a nié jusqu'à la légitimité même de l'État ukrainien. Il a porté atteinte à la souveraineté et à l'intégrité de l'Ukraine par la reconnaissance de l'indépendance de portions du territoire ukrainien. Face à cette stratégie de menace et de déstabilisation, l'Ukraine a fait preuve d'une retenue admirable. Elle n'a pas cédé à la violence en dépit des incitations russes. Je veux redire notre solidarité avec le peuple ukrainien, comme l'a rappelé le président Macron à son homologue ukrainien il y a quelques heures. Face à cette stratégie de désordre et de confrontation, les dirigeants d'Europe et des États-Unis ont démontré leur unité et redoublé d'efforts pour proposer une issue diplomatique. Le président Macron, en lien avec le chancelier Scholz et de nombreux partenaires, y ont pris toute leur part. Ils ont fait part de leur disponibilité à construire à la Russie une architecture de sécurité renouvelée pour l'Europe. La France condamne avec force la stratégie de provocation à la guerre du président russe. Nous entendons l'appel du peuple ukrainien, porté par le président Zelensky dans son adresse à la nation il y a quelques heures. Les Ukrainiens veulent la paix. Ils souhaitent une relation de bon voisinage avec la Russie, à l'image des relations familiales et personnelles qui unissent tant de Russes et du... Monsieur le Président, la communauté internationale a de manière unie fait entendre sa voix aujourd'hui à l'Assemblée générale. celle du respect de la Charte des Nations Unies, celle du règlement pacifique des conflits, celle de la diplomatie. Elle fait écho aux déclarations claires du secrétaire général. Nous appelons une nouvelle fois la Fédération de Russie à suivre cette voie, à revenir sur sa décision de reconnaissance des entités séparatistes de l'Est de l'Ukraine et à rappeler ses soldats. Nous appelons chacun des membres de ce Conseil à agir en responsabilité et à soutenir de manière résolue toutes les initiatives visant à prévenir et à mettre un terme aux violations de la Charte des Nations Unies. Si la Russie confirme le choix de la guerre, elle devra en assumer toutes les responsabilités et en payer le prix. Je vous remercie.
Я благодарю представителя Франции за его заявление.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'd like to thank the Secretary-General and Under-Secretary-General De Carlo for their very sobering remarks at the beginning of our meeting. Mr. President, tonight as we gather at this table, we are staring into the abyss of a major conflict in Europe, a conflict that would have major global implications. Tonight, the core principles of this United Nations, in which we believe, are under attack. In Ireland, we know the importance of the rules-based international order. We know the importance of respecting the voice and integrity of all countries, big or small. Most fundamentally, we know the value of peace. We believe that one state threatening and using lethal force against another to get its way or to expand its territory is no solution. Ireland has a deep understanding informed by that dialogue and respect resolve disputes. Tonight, this drives our solidarity with Ukraine. It is our collective responsibility, indeed our obligation here at this table, to maintain international peace and security, nothing less. That means we stand up for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of every member state of the United Nations. Let's be clear, the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine have not changed. The decision by Russia to recognize as independent entities the non-government controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine does not change those borders one iota. They did not change in 2014, and they have not changed this week. We urge the Russian Federation to reverse this decision immediately. We urge the Russian Federation to refrain from escalatory unilateral actions which can only serve to further deepen this crisis. Tonight, the path for diplomacy, the path for dialogue that we have called on for so long is perilously narrow. The principles of the UN Charter we hold dear have already been breached. These principles now risk being further violated. This is the time to show courage, the courage and the time now to pull back from the precipice, the time to return to dialogue and to diplomacy. The use of military aggression has no place in our modern world. Have we learned absolutely nothing from our history? These United Nations rose from the ashes of 2 world wars. The senseless destruction of that era was born of a belief that military might makes right. This philosophy, applied with modern weaponry, would unleash devastation and human suffering, affecting millions of innocent people. Tonight, we stand with the people of Ukraine. Tonight, we stand with the UN Charter. We stand with those who, even in this dark hour, still have the courage and hope to bring us back from this precipice. a resort to military conquest for one state to impose its will unilaterally against another, to annex part of its territory, has absolutely no place in the 21st century. There is still a choice to the path of diplomacy and dialogue. Mr. President, it is never too late to make the right choice. Thank you.
Я благодарю Ирландии за ее выступление. Предоставляю слово представителю Индии.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Secretary General for his briefing on the evolving situation in the eastern regions of Ukraine. The Security Council had met 2 days ago and discussed the situation. We had called for urgent de-escalation of tensions and emphasized on sustained and focused diplomacy to address all issues concerning the situation. However, we note with regret that the calls of the international community to give time to the recent initiatives undertaken by parties to diffuse tensions were not heeded to. The situation is in danger of spiraling into a major crisis. We express our deep concern over the developments which, if not handled carefully, may well undermine the peace and security of the region. We call for immediate de-escalation and for refraining from any further action that could contribute to a worsening of the situation. We call on all parties to exert greater efforts to bridge divergent interests. I would like to underline that the legitimate security interests of all parties should be fully taken into account. India has consistently advocated at the United Nations the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and with agreements entered into by parties concerned. I underline once again that more than 20,000 Indian nationals, including students, are located in different parts of Ukraine, including in its border areas. We are facilitating the return of all Indian nationals, including students, as may be required. We believe that the solution lies in sustained diplomatic dialogue between the concerned parties. In the meantime, we strongly emphasize the vital need for all sides to maintain international peace and security by exercising the utmost restraint. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Индии за его заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов.
سيد الرئيس، أود بداية أن أشكر الأمين العام ووكيلة الأمين العام على مداخلاتهما. اجتماعنا هذا هو الاجتماع الرابع الذي يعقده مجلس الأمن حول أوكرانيا في أقل من شهر. التوترات الأخيرة والمثيرة للقلق أخذت بلادي موقفاً يتمثل في الدعوة إلى خفض التصعيد والعمل على إيجاد حل سلمي للأزمة. وفي هذا الإطار نود أن نشير للجوانب التالية. أولاً، نؤكد على ضرورة اللجوء للحوار وبحسن نية مع تكثيف الجهود الدبلوماسية على كافة الأصعدة لدعم فرص السلام بالارتكاز للقانون الدولي. ونكرر أن اتفاقات مينسك لا تزال تشكل أساساً جيداً للوصول إلى حل سلمي للأزمة، وبما يحافظ على الأمن والاستقرار الإقليميين والدوليين. ثانياً، نشدد على ضرورة الالتزام بمبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة، لا سيما من حيث تسوية المنازعات الدولية بالوسائل السلمية واحترام سيادة واستقلال الدول ووحدة أراضيها وسلامتها الإقليمية. إن الالتزام بهذه المبادئ والامتثال لميثاق الأمم المتحدة يعد ركيزة أساسية للتوصل لأي حل مستدام وسلمي للأزمة القائمة. ثالثاً، نكرر بأن الوضع المتأزم في شرق أوكرانيا قد يفاقم من الوضع الحرج للمدنيين، ناهيكم عن استمرار وجود تحديات تتعلق بإيصال المساعدات الإنسانية لبعض المحتاجين، لا سيما في المناطق القريبة من خط النزاع في شرق يوكرانيا، وذلك قبل حدوث التوترات الحالية. إن أي تصعيد آخر قد يؤدي لتفاقم الوضع الإنساني لعدد أكبر من المدنيين، وعليه نكرر أهمية العمل على خفض التصعيد ووقف إطلاق النار، ونهيب في هذا الشأن بجميع الأطراف بأهمية عدم التعرض للمساعدات الإنسانية والمدنيين في مناطق النزاع بما يتماشى مع التزاماتهما بموجب القانون الدولي. وختاما السيد الرئيس، تجدد بلادي تأكيدها على أهمية وقف التصعيد واللجوء للحوار البناء ومواصلة العمل لإيجاد حلول سلمية تتسق مع القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة. وشكرا.
Я благодарю представителя Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов и предоставляю слово представителю Норвегии.
President, I thank the Secretary General and USG Rosemary DiCarlo for their important statement. We are facing the dire prospect of a major war in Europe. Norway strongly condemns the decision by President Putin to send Russian troops into Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and the latest announcements of special military operation. These decisions are unjustified, unprovoked, and irresponsible. We call on Russia to reverse these decisions and to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its military forces from the territory of Ukraine and in the vicinity of its internationally recognized borders. Our thoughts are with those who have already suffered too much due to this conflict, and with all those who are afraid that tomorrow will be a lot worse. We call upon all parties to strictly respect the relevant provisions of international humanitarian law, which calls on the protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and civilian infrastructure, and to facilitate safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need in Ukraine. Like the Secretary General clearly stated, the decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the so-called independent of Donetsk and Luhansk regions are violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and are inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Let me recall the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, which are now under threat. The Charter applies to all nations, including Russia. Today in the General Assembly, member states from all over the world strongly urge the parties to pursue negotiation towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict, with respect for international law and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Norway urges Russia, as a party to the Minsk Agreement and to the conflict, to fulfill its commitments, to abide by international law, and to return to the path of diplomacy. Russia has taken on a clear commitment to seek a peaceful settlement to this conflict and must honor it. We commend Ukraine's posture of restraint in the face of continued provocation and destabilization efforts. President, let me conclude by again reiterating Norway's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders. Thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Норвегии за ее заявление и сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Китая.
谢谢主席先生。主席先生，乌克兰局势正处于关键时刻，中方对此高度关注。当前形势下，有关各方都要保持克制，避免紧张局势进一步升级。我们相信，和平解决乌克兰问题的大门没有完全关上，也不应被关上。中方多次指出，乌克兰问题有其复杂历史经纬，局势演变至今是各种因素 综合作用的结果。中国关于维护国家主权和领土完整的立场是一贯的，联合国宪章的宗旨和原则也应当得到共同的维护。我们希望有关当事方保持冷静和理性，致力于根据联合国宪章原则，加强对话协商、谈判解决有关问题，妥善处理各方的合理安全关切。当前，尤其要避免激化矛盾。中方将继续以自己的方式劝和促谈，欢迎并鼓励一切致力于推动外交解决的努力。谢谢你，主席先生。
Я благодарю представителя Китая за его заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Бразилии.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the Secretary General and the Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for the information and remarks they have put before the Council tonight. Mr. President, the reports received about the movement of troops into certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine are cause for extreme concern. The threat or use of force against the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of a UN member state is unacceptable. In the present circumstances, the Security Council must act according to its main purpose, as holder of the primary responsibility under the United Nations Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security. In the exercise of this responsibility, its actions must be geared towards reduction in tensions, towards assisting parties in their negotiations. This is our primary role. The recourse to arms and confrontation cannot lead to lasting peace. In that regard, we call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and refrain from any action that may further increase tensions on the ground. The time is not for belligerent rhetoric, nor for military threats, but to engage truly in a diplomatic process. The means of negotiation have not been exhausted. Immediate de-escalation is of high order. It means, among others, complete and unconditional withdrawal of all military forces as an effective measure for the prevention and removal of threats to peace. Parties must abide by the terms of the Minsk agreements, above all by its call for a comprehensive ceasefire. The monitoring mission of the OSCE can assist if granted unrestrained access in order to verify, identify, and report accordingly any violation of the ceasefire. Furthermore, the parties must allow the rapid, safe, and unhindered access of humanitarian assistance to those in need. The protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and persons in vulnerable situations, must be respected unconditionally. We redouble our calls for the parties to work constructively in all relevant instances, such as the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group. Negotiations must be mindful of the principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of its member states. Negotiations must also, on one hand, take into account the security concerns of all parts of the conflict, and, on the other hand, aim to create the adequate conditions for an inclusive political dialogue which must reflect the diversity of and include representation from all peoples of the region. Brazil does not underestimate the complexity of the current situation, but we insist on dialogue as key to achieve a lasting settlement to this conflict. Too much is at stake here, above all the lives of many civilians. We owe them all our efforts to bring this crisis to a peaceful solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя Бразилии за его заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Ганы.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And let me begin by, first of all, thanking the Secretary General and USG, Rosemary DiCarlo, for their significant briefings. Mr. Secretary General, Ghana is grateful to you for your clear statements on the situation in Ukraine, in defense of the Charter, the rules-based international order, and our collective security mechanism. The developments that are taking place in Ukraine are indeed troubling. The situation has implications not only for Ukraine and its immediate neighbors, but also for all our countries. Security is indivisible, and the insecurity of one is the insecurity of all. As we indicated in our statement to the Council on Monday night, Ghana deeply regrets the decision of the Russian Federation to unilaterally recognize the non-government controlled regions of Ukraine and to send troops into those regions. We are also deeply concerned by the implications of those decisions, which suggest that the Russian Federation has turned its back on the Minsk agreements and the path of dialogue concerns it may have over the implementation of the agreements and related security concerns. We have, however, read in reports this morning the statement attributed to the President of the Russian Federation that his country was always open to diplomacy. We urge that that avowed commitment to diplomacy that the Russian Federation has alluded to should be backed by present actions that de-escalate the situation on the ground and permit an atmosphere for dialogue. We note with concern the risk that an escalation of the situation in Ukraine holds for global peace and security, and stress that those that choose the path of conflict rather than peace bear the consequences. We are concerned by reports of the commencement of hybrid warfare against Ukraine, especially attempts of cyber attacks against some of its critical infrastructure. To de-escalate the situation, we urge the Russian Federation to reconsider any intentions to move troops into the eastern regions of Ukraine in response to the purported request by the leaders of the separatist regions for an intervention. Peacekeeping by its nature requires the consent of the parties and the impartiality of the peacekeeping force. The presence of the Russian troops in eastern Ukraine at this time would not fulfill those requirements. If there is a real need, the Council should be seized of the matter. We urge for calm and call upon all parties to maintain the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. We are particularly concerned by the high intensity of violations of the ceasefire in recent days and its consequences on the civilian populations in the Donbas region. We remind all parties of the need to respect international law and international humanitarian law and urge the parties to guarantee unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance in both government and non-government controlled areas. We condemn any military activity that would deliberately target civilians and civilian infrastructure and remind all parties of the personal responsibility that exists in international law. Mr. President, it may be begging the question, but nonetheless worth repeating. Ghana unreservedly stands by the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, a bona fide member of the United Nations, whose membership of this organization provides for her guarantees over her internationally recognized borders, the same borders with which she joined this organization. We are aware that the current developments in the eastern regions of Ukraine would not lead to a strategic gain for any party and encourage efforts to address both immediate and long-term interests through diplomacy and dialogue. As called for by the preamble of the Charter, we remind all parties to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. Finally, we take this opportunity to urge all member states to exercise restraints on the respective unsettled but accepted situations across the globe and to uphold the collective security mechanism established through the Charter of the United Nations. Any differences that exist in international relations must be adjusted by peaceful and legal means. I thank you very much for your kind attention, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя Ганы за его заявление и сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Кении.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Secretary General for his urgent plea for peace and Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. In this grave moment, Kenya continues to call for respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine in line with the core tenets of the United Nations Charter. Kenya is deeply concerned by the rapid escalation of the conflict risks following the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states by the Russian Federation and the continued military escalation. We are concerned that there is a serious risk that a conflict enveloping the whole of the Donbas region will occur, present trends holding. Such a development would instantly lead to significant loss of life, a humanitarian crisis, and the large-scale population movement of refugees and internally displaced people. Kenya urgently calls for calm by all parties and their commitment to protecting civilians and civilian objects from any actions contrary to international law and international humanitarian law. We continue to believe that there is still an opportunity for diplomacy to produce a solution to this dangerous crisis. The required diplomatic steps should seek, in the short term, for a de-escalation of the situation and the limiting of all military maneuvers to prevent sparking a wider conflict. For this to happen, there must also be a stated commitment to negotiations between NATO and the Russian Federation in the middle and long term. Such a commitment will need the vision to design a viable security architecture for Europe that protects the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine and other states, while being sensitive to the concerns of all relevant parties. Mr. President, we want to believe that this chamber, in light of its storied past, retained the wisdom and wherewithal to prevent a catastrophic war. We have confidence that the United Nations Charter, embraced as a whole, protects Ukraine and all countries, not only those with modest military means, but also the world's nuclear powers. When we consider the recent past of wars undertaken by choice, and when the Charter and international law were breached, eventually the safety and security of all parties was tragically undermined. Mr. President, the membership of this chamber was fundamentally shaped by the states that emerged victorious from World War II. In doing so, the Charter bestowed on them a special responsibility that reflected the sacrifices they had made to defeat a unique evil to mankind. We believe that the leaders who designed today's multilateral system were profoundly humbled by the catastrophic war they had survived, so much so that they were inspired to erect the sovereign equality of states as a central pillar of our United Nations. As such, we urge all members to recall the ruin from war that has been experienced by most states sitting around this table. It is in this moment of peril that we can powerfully pivot to recommit to the Charter our predecessors bequeathed us. A large part of that recommitment would be aided by our listening to the Secretary General and utilizing his good offices to deliver according to their intended design. In the coming days, we hope that we will observe de-escalation in Donbas and that every effort will be made to protect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. We further hope that we will benefit from the visionary leadership that the world needs today in committing to negotiating a lasting European security architecture that lowers perceptions of threat and promotes cooperation. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Кении за его заявление. Сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Габона.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie le secrétaire général pour son adresse ainsi que la secrétaire générale adjointe, Mme Di Carlo, pour les informations fournies. Monsieur le Président, c'est la 4e fois en 3 semaines que ce Conseil s'est réuni pour débattre de la situation en Ukraine. Nous nous réunissons cette nuit, 48 heures après notre dernière séance, parce que l'intégrité territoriale et la souveraineté nationale de l'Ukraine ont été violées. Nous nous réunissons ce soir parce que d'innombrables vies humaines, des femmes et des enfants, sont pris dans les taux de la violence meurtrière et des affrontements à l'est de l'Ukraine, engendrant un exode massif qui met en péril la dignité et la survie de ces populations. Nous nous réunissons ce soir parce qu'une fois de plus, le spectre d'une guerre dont l'ampleur des conséquences est redoutée plane sur toute une région et parce que nous redoutons une invasion imminente de l'Ukraine. Au moment où nous rejetons les atteintes aux principes fondamentaux de la Charte des Nations Unies, il est important que notre élan nous conduise encore plus loin vers le respect de l'intégralité des dispositions de la Charte des Nations Unies et que l'attention de la communauté internationale soit portée avec le même engagement, avec la même ardeur dans toutes les situations et toutes les régions du monde où la sécurité et la dignité des peuples est menacée. Monsieur le Président, la décision de la Russie de reconnaître la souveraineté des républiques autoproclamées de Donetsk et de Lugansk est lourde de conséquences pour la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine. Elle met à mal la pertinence et la mise en œuvre des accords de Minsk et elle accrédite les craintes récurrentes d'une action militaire imminente contre l'Ukraine. Mon pays demeure fermement attaché au respect de la souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale de chaque État. Le strict respect de ces principes cardinaux consacrés par la Charte des Nations Unies et l'acte constitutif de l'Union africaine constitue le ciment de notre contrat social en tant que membre de la communauté internationale. Nous demeurons convaincus que l'intense activité diplomatique et les différentes démarches politiques de ces dernières semaines finiront par faire prévaloir la logique du dialogue face à celle de la confrontation et contribueront à éviter l'irréparable. Monsieur le Président, il y a 8 ans, dans un contexte analogue à celui qui nous réunit aujourd'hui, 52 États membres des Nations Unies se sont abstenus lors de l'adoption de la résolution 68/262 de l'Assemblée générale, alors que les mêmes principes fondamentaux de la Charte des Nations Unies qui nous réunissent aujourd'hui et dont nous déplorons étaient violés. Ce refus de s'aligner, au-delà des pressions subies par les délégations à New York comme dans les capitales à cette époque, pas si lointaine, traduit une certaine incompréhension et peut-être une lassitude d'une frange significative de la communauté internationale vis-à-vis de la persistance des zones d'influence que l'on croyait surannées après la décolonisation et la chute du mur de Berlin. Malheureusement, cette terrible réalité se révèle résiliente dans plusieurs parties du monde, notamment en Afrique, en Asie, en Amérique et aujourd'hui en Europe. Monsieur le Président, ce Conseil a besoin de garantir le respect des principes fondamentaux de la Charte des Nations Unies, en particulier le règlement pacifique des différends, le respect de l'intégrité territoriale des États et la souveraineté nationale. Mon pays appelle à un cessez-le-feu immédiat et à la désescalade, ainsi qu'au sens de la responsabilité, en privilégiant les issues pacifiques de règlement des différends, conformément à la Charte des Nations Unies, et demande aux parties à protéger les civils et les infrastructures civiles et à s'abstenir de toute action pouvant entraver le déploiement de l'aide humanitaire pour les populations qui en ont besoin. Pour terminer, je voudrais réaffirmer la conviction de mon pays pour un ordre international fondé sur les règles et non sur la loi du plus fort. Et nous exhortons l'ensemble des parties à ne pas rompre le fil du dialogue et à saisir toutes les opportunités susceptibles de ramener la paix en Ukraine. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Я благодарю представителя Габона за его выступление. Сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Мексики.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Mi país agradece la presencia y el llamado del secretario general en esta sala, mismo que respaldamos. Agradecemos también la actualización que presentó la subsecretaria Di Carlo. México lamenta que, a pesar del llamado generalizado de la comunidad internacional, las tensiones alrededor de Ucrania, en lugar de haber disminuido, han aumentado. Es por ello que esta noche nos vemos obligados a reunirnos nuevamente aquí. Todos los estados, al haber ratificado la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, nos comprometimos a respetar la soberanía, la independencia política y la integridad territorial de los estados. Los miembros del Consejo de Seguridad tenemos la responsabilidad primordial en el mantenimiento de la paz y la seguridad internacionales. Ello genera la obligación de garantizar que el Consejo de Seguridad pueda desempeñar su mandato y de velar por el respeto de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. México respalda todas las declaraciones del secretario general e insta a las partes a hacer uso de los buenos oficios que el secretario general ha ofrecido. El presidente de México declaró esta misma mañana que no aceptamos que un país invada a otro, ya que es contrario al derecho internacional. Recordamos una vez más que Rusia realizó hace unos días, aquí mismo, ante la comunidad internacional, una declaración contundente de que no invadiría Ucrania. El reciente anuncio de una misión especial es contraria a esta declaración. De darse una invasión, ello constituiría un acto de agresión de conformidad con la resolución 3314 de la Asamblea General. No claudicaremos en nuestro llamado a la distensión, a la diplomacia y al diálogo. Una solución diplomática es la única vía que evitará caer en el precipicio que implicaría una guerra en Europa. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Я благодарю представителя Мексики за ее заявление. Сейчас я сделаю заявление в своем качестве представителя Российской Федерации. Уважаемые коллеги, сегодня у нас выдался интенсивный день с точки зрения обсуждения украинского кризиса. Я не буду повторять сказанное мною утром в Генеральной Ассамблее. Могу лишь с сожалением констатировать по итогам дня, что наши сигналы Киеву о необходимости прекращения провокаций против Луганской и Донецкой народных республик не были услышаны. Похоже, что у наших украинских коллег, которые в последнее время активно вооружают и подзуживают ряд государств, не исчезало заблуждение о том, что с благословения западных кураторов они могут добиться военного решения проблемы Донбасса. Иначе сложно объяснить существенную интенсификацию обстрелов и диверсионных актов на территории республик. СММ ОБСЕ зафиксировал за истекшие сутки почти 2000 случаев нарушения режима прекращения огня, в том числе почти 1500 взрывов. Дончане и луганчане по-прежнему вынуждены укрываться в подвалах. Продолжается наплыв беженцев в Россию. Одним словом, характер провокаций вооруженных сил Украины не изменился. Вы этого замечать не хотите, повторяя украинской басни о том, что дончане чуть ли не сами себя обстреливают. Удивляет, что возрастающие страдания жителей Донбасса никак не трогают наших западных коллег. В ходе целого дня сегодняшних дебатов в Генассамблее у вас для них не нашлось слов сочувствия и сострадания. Такое впечатление, что этих 4 миллионов человек для вас словно и не существует. Я хотел бы напомнить о том, что принцип суверенитета и территориальной целостности государств, в нарушении которого применительно к Украине нас сегодня обвиняли, согласно Декларации о принципах международного права, касающихся дружественных связей между народами, принятой в 1970 году, должен неукоснительно соблюдаться в отношении государств, я цитирую, соблюдающих в своих практических действиях принцип равноправия и самоопределения народов и вследствие этого имеющих правительство, представляющие без различия расы, вероисповедания и цвета кожи весь народ, проживающий на данной территории. Конец цитаты. Сегодняшнее правительство Украины таковым, конечно же, не является. Ведь трагедия Украины началась как раз после нелегитимного майданного переворота в 2014 году, когда вместо диалога с русскоязычными жителями Украины новая власть обрушила на них пушки и самолеты. Информации и свидетельств на этот счет предостаточно, однако наши западные партнеры предпочитали их не замечать. Мы постарались вчера и сегодня, и позавчера и сегодня, объяснить вам логику принятых руководством России решений о признании ЛНР и ДНР. Акцентировали необходимость обеспечения там мира и безопасности. Однако вы нас услышать не хотели и не хотите. Для вас, жители Донбасса, исключительно разменная монета в геополитической игре направлена на ослабление России и продвижение блока НАТО к ее границам. Для нас же это женщины, дети и старики, 8 лет прячущиеся от украинских обстрелов и провокаций. Для нас это и украинский народ, страдающий под гнетом майданной власти. В этом разница наших подходов. Не сменив геополитическую оптику, вы нас никогда не поймете. Но зато нам бесконечно благодарны те, ради кого принимались упомянутые мной решения, те, о ком вы не вспоминали все эти 8 лет, называя их исключительно пророссийскими сепаратистами и террористами. И для нас это самое главное. Хотел бы вновь повторить, что корень сегодняшнего кризиса вокруг Украины в действиях самой Украины, занимавшейся многолетним саботажем своих прямых обязательств по Минскому комплексу мер. Еще на прошлой неделе существовала надежда на то, что в Киеве одумаются и все-таки выполнят то, под чем подписались в 2015 году. Для этого прежде всего был нужен прямой диалог с Донецком и Луганском. Однако очередное подтверждение неготовности Украины к такому диалогу, к шагам по предоставлению Донбассу особого статуса, предусмотренным Минскими соглашениями, причем с поддержкой этой позиции западными покровителями, окончательно убедило нас в том, что мы просто не имеем права заставлять жителей Донбасса страдать и дальше. Поскольку, как я уже сказал, украинские провокации против донбассцев не только не прекратились, но и интенсифицировались, руководство ЛНР и ДНР обратилось к нам с просьбой оказать военную поддержку в соответствии с двусторонними договорами о сотрудничестве, заключенными одновременно с их признанием. Это логичный шаг, являющийся следствием действий украинского режима. В ходе этого заседания президент России Путин обратился с обращением, в котором он сообщил, что принял решение о специальной военной операции на Донбассе. Мы не знаем всех деталей сегодня, но кратко хочу сообщить, что из его тезиса следует, что оккупация Украины в наши планы не входит. Цель этой спецоперации – защиты людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины, а также преданию суду тех, кто совершил многочисленные кровавые преступления против мирных жителей, в том числе граждан Российской Федерации. Это решение было принято в соответствии со статьей 51 Устава ООН, санкций Совета Федерации Российской Федерации и во исполнении соглашения о дружбе и взаимопонимании с ДНР и ЛНР. Сейчас поступает много информации на эту тему, ее пока еще предстоит проанализировать. Будем держать вас в курсе событий. Сейчас я возобновляю свои функции председателя Совета Безопасности и предоставляю слово представителю Украины.
Well, distinguished members of the Security Council, Secretary General, Under-Secretary, before I try to deliver parts of the statement that I came here with tonight, most of it is already useless since 10 p.m. New York time. I would like to cite Article 4 of the UN Charter, and it says, membership in the United Nations is open to all other peace-loving states which accept the obligations contained in the present charter and in the judgment of the organization are able and willing to carry out these obligations. Russia is not able to carry out any of the obligations. The ambassador of the Russian Federation 3 minutes ago confirmed that his president declared a war on my country. So before I read part of my statement, I would like to avail of the presence of the Secretary General and request the Secretary General to distribute among the members of the Security Council and the members of the General Assembly the legal memos by the Legal Council of the United Nations dated December 1991, and in particular the legal memo dated 19th of December 1991, the one that we've been trying to get out of the Secretariat for a very long time, and we were denied to get it. The Article 4, Paragraph 2 of the Charter reads, "The admission of any such state to membership in the United Nations will be effected by a decision of the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council." Mr. Secretary General, please instruct the Secretariat to distribute among the members of the Security Council and the members of the General Assembly a decision by the Security Council dated December 1991 that recommends that the Russian Federation can be a member of this organization, as well as a decision by the General Assembly dated December 1991, where General Assembly welcomes the Russian Federation to this organization. It would be a miracle if the Secretariat is able to produce such decisions. There is nothing in the Charter of the United Nations about continuity as a sneaky way to get into the organization. So when I was coming here an hour ago or so, I was intending to ask the Russian ambassador to confirm on the record that the Russian troops will not start firing at Ukrainians today and go ahead with the offensive. It became useless 48 minutes ago. Because about 48 minutes ago, your president declared the war on Ukraine. So now I would like to ask the ambassador of the Russian Federation to say on the record that at this very moment, your troops do not shell and bomb Ukrainian cities, that your troops do not move in the territory of Ukraine. You have a smartphone, you can call Lavrov right now. We can make a pause to let you go out and call him. If you are not in a position to give an affirmative answer, the Russian Federation ought to relinquish responsibilities of the President of the Security Council, pass these responsibilities on to a legitimate member of the Security Council, a member that is respectful of the Charter, and I ask the members of the Security Council to convene an emergency meeting immediately and consider all necessary draft decisions to stop the war. Because it's too late, my dear colleagues, to speak about de-escalation. Too late. the Russian president declared the war on the record. Should I play the video of your president? Ambassador, shall I do that right now, or you can confirm it? Do not interrupt me, please. Thank you.
Then don't ask me questions when you are speaking. Proceed with your statement.
Anyway, you declared the war. It is the responsibility of this body to stop the war. So I call on every one of you to do everything possible to stop the war. Or should I play the video with your president declaring the war? Thank you very much.
Опять я вынужден сказать фразу, что я благодарю представителя Украины за его выступление. На вопросы я отвечать не планирую. Все, что я знаю сегодня, я уже сказал. Будить министра Лаврова в это время я не собираюсь. Мы сказали вам, что информация о том, как развиваются события, мы вам предоставим. И не называйте это войной, это называется военной операцией на Донбассе. А сейчас я предоставляю слово представителю Германии.
Mr. President, we meet at the very moment of a military escalation we have not experienced in Europe for over a generation's time. The President of the Russian Federation announced a military operation on Ukrainian territory. We condemn this in the strongest possible terms. And we call upon all members of the Security Council and the United Nations to now stand up for Ukraine and against a shameless breach of international law. 2 days ago, Russia's decision to recognize the self-proclaimed so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk was harshly rejected in this Council. It had already dealt a devastating blow to the principles and the international order that the United Nations stand for. Russia has not listened, and it turns out it was not prepared to listen. It has continued its massive military buildup, and we observed and observe cyber attacks directed against Ukraine, and now Russian military is moving into Ukrainian territory. By the actions and this unprovoked military operation, Russia is violating the core principles of the UN Charter. We condemn the use of force against innocent people and the violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. We urge Russia to terminate its military action against Ukraine immediately and withdraw its troops. Mr. President, our thoughts are with the Ukrainian people. We will be steadfast in our support for Ukraine and our support for the UN Charter. The Russian aggression will come at an unprecedented price politically, economically, and morally. Mr. President, France, Ukraine, and my country stood ready for diplomacy, for another meeting in the Normandy format, or for the summit that Ukraine had proposed. With our allies and partners, we called on Russia to seek a diplomatic way forward in vain. Now is the moment to speak up and defend the international order of the UN Charter against unilateral aggression, jointly and decisively. Tonight we stand with Ukraine, and we are doing so unwavering and determined. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя Германии за ее заявление. А сейчас я предоставляю слово Соединенным Штатам, которые попросили слово для дополнительного заявления.
Thank you. In my remarks tonight, I said that we predicted Russia's false flag attacks, the misinformation, the theatrical emergency meetings, and the cyber attacks. But one piece had not come to pass. Unfortunately, while we've been meeting in the Security Council tonight, it appears that President Putin has ordered that last step. At the exact time as we are gathered in the Council seeking peace, Putin delivered a message of war in total disdain for the responsibility of this Council. This is a grave emergency. The Council will need to act, and we will put a resolution on the table tomorrow. As President Biden said tonight, Russia alone is responsible for the death and destruction this attack will bring, and the United States and our allies and partners will respond in a united and decisive way. The world will hold Russia accountable. Thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Соединенных Штатов за ее заявление. Сейчас хочу предоставить слово представителю Соединенного Королевства, который попросил его для того, чтобы сделать дополнительное заявление.
Thank you. As we sat in this chamber urging Russia to step back, President Putin announced special military operations on Ukrainian territory. This is unprovoked and unjustified. This is a grave day for Ukraine and for the principles of the United Nations. We and our partners have been clear that there will be consequences for Russia's actions. We fully support the United States call for a UN Security Council resolution. This Council must do all it can to stop the war and uphold the Charter. Thank you.
Благодарю представителя Соединенного Королевства. И сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Албании, который также хотел бы сделать дополнительные заявления.
Dear colleagues, we could not end this meeting that what we had feared and anticipated since days is happening. Explosions are reported in Kiev and in several other cities in Ukraine. Masks are finally down and tanks are in. As we speak, Russia is implementing its plan and attacking a neighbor to whom it has decided to deny existence, freedom, the land, dignity, and life. We call on all the members of the United Nations to rally in support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, to stand with Ukraine and its people, to condemn firmly and unequivocally this aggression, to stand for peace, for rules, for international law, and take whatever measures they deem necessary to show the aggressor that its actions will bear consequences. Let me reiterate, Russia will be held responsible for the consequences of an unprovoked war, for the loss of human lives, for causing unbearable human pain, and for opting for destruction when we need development, for bringing death where we aspire for need, for hope, for choosing to become an outlaw when we need cooperation. Russia will bear historical blame and shame and the consequences of invading a neighboring country and attempting to destroy European security. Let's unite and make sure it will not succeed. Thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Албании. Сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Франции для дополнительного заявления.
Monsieur le Président, au moment où nous nous réunissions en urgence pour essayer de prévenir le pire et le déclenchement d'une guerre, nous avons appris, comme vous tous, que le président de la Fédération de Russie avait ordonné une opération militaire spéciale dans le Donbass et que la Russie s'efforcera de démilitariser l'Ukraine. La Russie a donc fait le choix de la guerre. La France condamne dans les termes les plus forts le déclenchement de ces opérations. Cette décision annoncée au moment même où ce Conseil se réunit illustre le mépris dans lequel la Russie tient le droit international et les Nations Unies. La Russie doit en être comptable devant le Conseil de sécurité. C'est pourquoi la France se joindra à ses partenaires au sein de ce Conseil pour préparer dans les prochaines heures une résolution condamnant la guerre conduite par la Russie. Nous appelons l'ensemble des membres de ce Conseil à nous soutenir dans ces circonstances tragiques. Nous appelons la Fédération de Russie à respecter le droit international humanitaire en toutes circonstances. Nous appelons à la protection et au respect de tous les civils, notamment les personnes vulnérables, les femmes, les enfants et le personnel humanitaire. Je vous remercie.
Я благодарю представителя Франции и предоставляю слово представителю Ирландии для дополнительного заявления.
When I spoke earlier, I said that the path for diplomacy and the path for dialogue was perilously narrow, and I didn't realize how narrow and indeed how close to the precipice we really were just over an hour ago. We now see that that path has been closed by the announcement of military aggression on the part of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. That is something that we roundly condemn. We stand with the people of Ukraine tonight, with every man, woman and child who is seeing this news as we did, as we sat here in the chamber, and whose lives are at risk. We believe it is now time indeed for this Council to stand up and assume its responsibility and to speak out in the strongest possible terms about this act of aggression. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя Ирландии. Сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Украины для дополнительного заявления.
Well, as I said, relinquish your duties as a chair. Call Putin, call Lavrov to stop aggression. And I welcome the decision of some members of this Council to meet as soon as possible to consider the necessary decision that would condemn the aggression that you launch on my people. There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
Я бы хотел сказать в заключение, что мы не производим агрессию против украинского народа, а против той хунты, которая захватила власть Киева. Список ораторов исчерпан, заседание закрывается.